Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, you know this already, and I think our listeners also know, if they listen carefully, that I am a liberal, and at this point in the election cycle, liberals like to catastrophize about all the things that could possibly go wrong for their candidate. And I think in the context of that catastrophizing is how I came up with the question for this episode about immigration. I've been thinking about immigration as an issue that can easily break against Democrats. But because this is mansplaining, as opposed to any political horse race podcast you can get on the internet, I didn't ask you, Mark, whether immigration is going to sink Joe Biden next year. Instead, I asked you to take a look at this long-standing political issue of immigration to see how we might solve it. So, is there a solution to this problem, Mark? And if so, what is it?
Well, thank you, as always, for the question. Immigration, like you say, is a very big issue, and it's getting bigger all the time, and not just here in the U.S. According to the United Nations, there were 281 million migrants in the world in 2020, up from 173 million in 2000, a growth of 63% over the course of 20 years. The top country of destination for these migrants was the United States, and the top three countries of origin for these migrants were India, China, and Mexico. 11.7 million migrants left Mexico in 2020, no doubt many of them to the United States. Over time, immigration to the U.S. has been growing, but it's actually growing faster internationally. According to United Nations data, over the last 30 years, immigration to the U.S. has grown by 87%, but international immigration has increased 267% over the same period. You mentioned in your original question in our previous episode that cities like your own are struggling under the weight of immigration, and that's being felt all across the world, in Germany, France, England, and other destinations that seem promising to desperate people globally. But immigration has become such a hot-button issue in our own politics that immigrants and illegal immigrants almost seem like synonymous terms. Of course, though, that's not true. Many people arrive in this country legally, and many of them bring such highly valuable skills that our government has set up programs to explicitly encourage them to come here. For example, the H-1B visa program allows skilled workers in fields like science, technology, and engineering to work in the United States for a temporary period. The program exists to draw in workers who can contribute to our economy and help fill gaps in the workforce.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I don't like calling undocumented immigrants illegal because immigration to the United States is legal. Now, applying for asylum is legal.
Yeah.
It's only if you overstay your welcome or ignore your obligations in the process that you potentially verge over into illegal.
Yeah, illegal is definitely a term of disparagement. You find when you go into this that the offices that govern these things use the term undocumented immigrants, which I think is a better description of the reality.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, there are people who resent H-1B immigrants, since those visas go to people coming in with valuable skills, which allow them to take high-paid jobs. And to illustrate this, I have a trivia question for you, Joe.
Okay.
CEOs of 3 large, famous American companies were at one point in their lives in this country on an H-1B visa. Can you name them?
Probably not, but I will venture a guess that Elon Musk is one of them. And I would also say Sundar Pichai. Is that the way his name is pronounced? I would guess that he's another one. And let me try just for the triple here, Sergey Brin.
You got 1/3 of those right. Sundar Pichai did hold an H-1B visa. He actually entered the company on a green card, but he took on H-1B status so that his wife could join him in the country. The other two are Satya Nadella, the current CEO of Microsoft, and Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of Pepsi. But H-1B visas are not a big part of the immigration scenario. Congress caps H-1B visas at 65,000 per year. That's just over 6% of all legal immigration into this country, which is a relative drop in the bucket. A much bigger strain on the system of the immigrants to the U.S. who are coming from places like Venezuela, where political repression or bleak economic conditions may drive millions of people to seek new lives in other countries. Since it can take a long time to work through the system and immigrate legally to this country, many take a shortcut, entering on a tourist visa and then failing to leave when the visa expires. According to the Department of Homeland Security, there were 853,955 overstays of tourist visas in 2022, which represented 3.67% of all tourist visa admissions in that year. And Venezuela was the top country for tourist visa overstays. A whopping 47% of Venezuelans who entered the country in 2022 on a tourist visa did not exit the country when they were supposed to. Others find other ways to cross the border from Mexico or Canada. According to the Department of Homeland Security, there were an estimated 11.3 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States in 2020, about 1/4 of the total immigrant population in the U.S. U.S. Customs and Border Protection statistics indicate that 2.8 million illegal immigrants were captured in 2022, and that number, of course, doesn't include the people who successfully made it past border control and the police and made it into this country illegally.
Right.
In 2023, the number is higher. We're already at 3.2 million, even though the year isn't complete yet. So this is the problem we need to solve: illegal immigration. It is often dangerous and carries a high human cost. No one wants people to die in the desert simply because they're looking for a better life for themselves and their families. Similarly, you want to exercise some control over the people who enter this country. If they're here simply looking for an honest wage, we need them. Migrant workers are important to agriculture and other industries in this country. Joe, can you guess the percentage of U.S. agricultural workers who were born in this country and what percentage were immigrants?
I'm going to say that it's a huge number, probably 90% composed of immigrants.
Not entirely, but it is a big number. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, 30% of agricultural workers in the U.S. were native-born, and 6% were immigrants who had obtained U.S. citizenship. 23% were immigrants here on green cards or as permanent residents, while the remaining 41% are undocumented. If somehow all illegal immigrants were apprehended and deported, food production would plummet and costs would skyrocket. We'd be spending a good part of every day standing in line outside of grocery stores. Our quality of life and our cost of living depend on the cheap labor that migrant laborers provide. In 2021, there were 2.8 million migrant laborers in agriculture, 1.2 million in construction, 1.1 million in the hospitality industry, 700,000 in healthcare, and 600,000 in manufacturing. No matter how you look at it, our economy depends on migrant labor.
Yes. And let's also remember that migrants do many of the jobs that we Americans won't do.
Yes.
Like the picking of fruit that you mentioned earlier. And also, I think, being caregivers to the elderly is another one.
Yes. Or the classic landscape worker in Los Angeles.
Yes. Yes.
If it's low wage, if it's high labor, if it's dangerous, it's a very good chance that it's a migrant who's working that job rather than a native-born American.
Yeah, and also low prestige, too, because of the low wage. And the irony, of course, is what you said earlier. We depend so heavily on that fruit that they're picking and the care they're giving to our institutionalized elderly relatives, that they should actually be paid at the top of the wage scale, in my opinion.
Yes.
And yet they're not.
Yes, agreed. On the flip side of the coin, you want to be able to keep out hardened criminals and others who would threaten the safety and security of our communities. I think Most people would agree with this, with the exception of hardcore opponents of immigration, of course, who would lock our borders to all comers and would probably kick out a lot of their fellow Americans while they were at it. But if you're trying to reform immigration rather than eradicate it, the question is how? I'd like to suggest that we begin answering that question by giving up on the fantasy that we can build big walls to keep illegal immigrants out.
Hear, hear.
For as long as there's been human history, there have been people who thought that a really big wall would solve their problems.
Yes.
From the Great Wall of China to Hadrian's Wall in northern England to Israeli walls along the Gaza border, walls always fail. Time and time again, we've seen that someone will find a way over, under, or around the wall.
Yeah, and even putting aside the merits or the effectiveness, though I agree with you that it's ineffective, a wall is an abomination symbolically for the United States. I feel like it's a renunciation of our national credo, the Emma Lazarus poem, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. A wall undermines all of that, and I think it's just a disastrous idea.
I am dismayed at how controversial the Statue of Liberty has become.
Yes.
In our own country. When you and I were young, it was the undisputed symbol of our country, and now there are plenty who would take down that sign and put up something else, more likely stay off our lawn. So for a number of reasons, let's just forget about building a big wall on the Mexican border. It will be a big, dumb, expensive project that makes us look bad and that will immediately and predictably fail.
Yes.
You could take the money you'd spend on the wall and instead spend it on more border control agents, but I feel like that's a Band-Aid on the problem rather than an actual solution. If you stop a desperate person at the border and send them back to their home country, they'll be even more desperate and probably will just get started planning their next attempt to cross into the country. A study published in the journal Migration Studies in 2019 found that the risk of reentry increases with every deportation. In many cases because they have family in the country that they're trying to get back to. Deporting undocumented workers makes them more likely to come back, not less likely. Statistically speaking, the only migrant workers who are not likely to return are the ones who leave voluntarily.
The logic of what you just said is unimpeachable, Mark. I agree with you. And yet, even though it offends the sensibilities of many liberals, myself included, I still feel like increased enforcement has to be part of any grand bargain that's reached for immigration in this country, because I think it's a politically practical position. We have to demonstrate that we can control our borders, and that's one way to do it, beefing up border control agents.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. In crafting this answer, I kind of bracketed political expedience because that was going to send me down a path of despair.
Yes.
Where I was going to have trouble coming up with any answer.
Yes.
So I did not really consider what it would take to get it through Congress. If you're trying to get Republican support, you would need to include some enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, and I just want to say, in fairness to you, I urged you not to think about political practicalities and focus on sensible solutions. So you're quite right in narrowing your focus.
Yeah. So I believe a more common sense approach would be to streamline the process for entering this country legally, for starters. The data clearly shows that when the immigration process is less slow and bureaucratic, the number of illegal immigrants falls. A smart approach to immigration reform would include a system that accelerates processing for applicants based on criteria like job market needs, familial connections, and humanitarian considerations. And it should also address visa overstays by upgrading the tracking system so fewer of these people fall through the cracks, and offers a more flexible system that allows for adjustments to an individual's immigration status based on changing circumstances. It would also be smart to invest in upskilling of workers who might be displaced by immigrant labor, something that we'll need to do in any case given that automation and artificial intelligence, which we've touched on in many previous episodes, are going to displace large number of workers no matter what we do with regard to immigration. But that's probably a topic for its own episode.
Yep.
These measures would help, but there would probably still be a serious undocumented immigrant problem left over. which is why I would argue that you need to address illegal immigration by cutting it off at its source. As much as we like to talk about America the Beautiful, undocumented immigrants aren't entering this country because they want to see our Purple Mountain majesty. They're here because back home they had little to no chance for a good life. Sometimes it's due to war or genocide or other forms of political unrest, but most often it's simple desperation. They can't put food on the table at home, so they go looking for some place where they'll have a better chance. If we don't want them coming here, it follows that we do want them to have a better chance back home. And that brings us to the topic of economics, specifically trade agreements and investment. That's to say, to make a serious dent in illegal immigration, we need economic growth within immigrants' countries of origin. Give them good jobs at home so they don't go looking for jobs somewhere else. Traditionally, this has been pursued through free trade agreements. The thinking is that free trade boosts the economies of all the countries covered by the agreement. Better business means more and better jobs for those countries' citizens, and more and better jobs means less poverty, less political turmoil, and less migration. In practice, however, free trade agreements have often been criticized for benefiting large corporations, weakening environmental regulations, and exacerbating income inequality. Instead, a more effective approach could involve targeted investments in the countries in which immigrants are coming. This sounds relatively simple on its face. In reality, investment could be a complex matter contingent on the specific needs and conditions of the target nations. It would involve partnering with local governments and NGOs to build sustainable economic models, focusing on things like infrastructure, education, and job training programs. Now, this isn't the sort of thing that can be imposed on other countries. It would involve a lot of politics, diplomacy, and partnership. It's easier said than done, but by investing in countries' infrastructure, education, and healthcare, we can lay the foundation for economic growth and development without directly incentivizing companies to do the things that have given globalization a bad name. And I'm also partial to the idea of microlending as an immigration deterrent. For our listeners, microlending is a type of financing that provides small loans to entrepreneurs, typically in developing countries, a few $100s to a few $1,000s to recipients who want to start or grow small businesses. Raising the standard of living in impoverished communities would have a well-documented secondary effect, a decline in the fertility rate. As people are lifted out of poverty, they have fewer children. Fewer children means less young adults entering the workforce every year, which means fewer unemployed and less international migration.
I like everything you're saying in this section, Mark. If I could just get back to the investment piece, though. It's politically difficult, and I would argue that's because people are so short-sighted about the investment, and they don't understand what the word investment means. Yeah. You know, when you invest here in the United States in pre-K programs, for example, for every dollar you put into that program, you reap a dividend of many times more dollars in the productiveness and capacities of that young person who you're giving education to. And I think similarly with these investment programs in these economically depressed countries, you're helping them out of the economic morass they're in so that their workers are more productive, which indirectly benefits the United States' bottom line and makes it much less likely that their workers will be fleeing to our border to find a better life. And if they do, they'll be better educated and better trained in their home countries and more likely to make a positive effect on our economy through immigration. So it's a complete win-win, but because people are so short-sighted about the initial investment, it's a tough one to pull off politically.
Yeah, I think people tend to think of investments as sort of an immediate give and take.
Yes.
Where like you invest money in the bank and you get interest back.
Yes.
You buy stocks and the stocks go up. And in this case, you need to connect the dots between investing in, let's say, Venezuelan poverty eradication, and then the savings is in spending less money on border enforcement and tracking people down and deporting them.
Yes.
And military outlays, because This has become a hot spot. And so you get the return on investment, but it's indirectly in various different spots. And so it's not clear of this is because of that.
Exactly.
Whereas if we could find some way just to make that clear or to establish the connection, it might have some force, but people have trouble holding those two ideas in their head.
Precisely.
In a truly comprehensive immigration plan, such economic efforts would be accompanied by measures to support free elections, promote human rights, and provide foreign aid contingent on these basic principles, because those are the supports that economic growth would require. And then thinking further down the road, when people come to this country, even if they come legally, there's the question of assimilation. They may reside in America, but we want them to feel like they have become American, in the broadest sense of that term. So that would call for policies to support English language acquisition and make it easy for recent arrivals to access education and employment opportunities. And there's also an argument to be made that we would need community-based programs that foster intercultural understanding. America is a fluid concept, changing all the time. We are a country defined as much by our differences as by the things we have in common. But immigrants do need to feel at home here, and likewise, we need them to feel committed to this country and its core values. In the big picture, diversity of thought is beneficial. It unlocks innovation and keeps our society moving forward. In the short term and on the local level, though, it can be the source of social strife and violence. It can be a lightning rod for racist sentiment, and immigrants who go unassimilated tend to feel alienated from this country in ways that can be dangerous. This is a complex issue that a number of countries are struggling with. France, for instance, in 2004 passed a law prohibiting Muslim women from wearing face-covering headgear such as the burqa, on the grounds that it's a public religious display that is inconsistent with France's official value of secularism. Naturally, this has caused a great deal of controversy within the Muslim community. It's inspired violence, and it's also controversial among others who see it as an unacceptable restriction on personal liberty and freedom of choice. This is too nuanced and multifaceted for me to get into here. Once again, it would be a meaty episode topic all on its own. So for now, I'll simply brand assimilation as both important and also difficult to do well. And finally, there's the question of the people who are already in this country illegally, the undocumented population. Personally, I don't see any real point in deporting them. The threat of deportation will simply drive them underground, where it will be difficult and expensive to locate them. It serves to maintain an illegal population, not eradicate it.
And not to mention that many of them have been here for years and feel like they're Americans.
Exactly.
They're tax-paying citizens.
Yeah. They might have children who have graduated from college.
Yes.
They have deep roots. They're loyal to this country.
Yes.
A path to citizenship would bring these people into the daylight and get them paying taxes, for one thing. So there you have my plan. Make it easier to immigrate legally, make targeted investments in immigrants' countries of origin, and provide a path to citizenship to the undocumented workers who are already here. None of these ideas are new. They all have decades of history behind them. None of them are simple or straightforward. If you imagine the difficulty of pursuing one of these paths, getting it through Congress, fighting off legal challenges, and implementing it in a way that accounts for all of the specifics and is flexible enough to change as circumstances change, that would be very difficult. It's not simply a matter of passing legislation or launching a program. Your efforts would need to bear fruit today and continue to do so indefinitely.
Yes.
So it goes without saying that pursuing all three of these paths would be much, much more difficult, especially since so many people in this country see immigration as a zero-sum game that gives wealth to foreigners by taking it away from native citizens. Even if immigration reform benefits the country as a whole, if it does so at the cost of local communities, that could swing elections and ensure that the reforms are rolled back. In short, I'm not optimistic about our prospects of finding a solution for this problem. Negative immigration sentiment today is aimed at Mexicans and Muslims. In the 19th century, it was Chinese and Irish immigrants who were said to be the problem. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, 140 years ago, but in spirit it's not that different from the anti-immigrant rhetoric you hear today.
Yes, true.
Our problem, it seems to me, isn't immigration. Our problem is the fact that after all this time, we're still arguing over exactly the same things. America is a nation of immigrants whose descendants want to keep out other immigrants. It's our most fundamental contradiction, and it looks like it will stay that way for decades and possibly centuries to come.
Yeah, boy, I love your presentation, Mark. You brought up a whole bunch of things I had not considered, the investment piece, the assimilation piece. But I want to start with the last point you made, the rhetorical question about why is it that these formerly despised newcomers, the Irish, the Italians, the Puerto Ricans, establish themselves here and then they want to pull the door closed behind them,
Yeah.
I was thinking, what is that about? And I have a theory I want to run by you and see whether you think this has merit. I feel like it might be a way for those populations to distinguish themselves as us as opposed to them.
Mm-hmm.
They're no longer them. They're now us. What better way to make that clear than to slam the door behind them and not let anybody else in?
Yeah. I like that framework, particularly since it plugs so easily into our episode on heroism, which we did 2 episodes ago, with hero narratives framing things on us versus them framework. I do think that's accurate.
Yeah.
The other thing that comes to mind is something that I heard about a long time ago, which was an explanation for why you tend to see racist sentiment expressed most strongly among poor white communities. And the economic argument was basically that hatred blooms in the presence of threat. If you are at threat of being displaced by an immigrant worker, you are going to hate immigrants a lot more than someone who feels secure in that.
Yes. Yes.
So I think a good chunk of it is what you mentioned. I think another good chunk of it is that the opposition to immigration just comes from economic vulnerability by our own population.
Yes.
And so maybe my framework was too narrow, and that in order to truly solve this problem, we need to think about targeted economic investment here as well to remove the tensions that surface in the form of anti-immigration sentiment. Like maybe that should be part of the immigrant reform movement.
Yeah. So my comprehensive immigration reform proposal is much simpler than yours. I think yours is better, quite frankly, but I just want to put on the record what I thought there were really 3 prongs to mine. And one was agreeing with you wholeheartedly, a path to legalization for the dreamers and other unauthorized immigrants who are already here, i.e. amnesty. And then I think liberalized worker visas for the new workers we need, the high-tech workers who really do increase our GDP and help us innovate our way out of problems like climate change and computer chips and all that stuff. I think it's really important that we have much higher numbers of worker visas. And then the third thing is the one thing we seem to disagree about. I do think increased border enforcement needs to be part of the plan, but it doesn't all have to be punitive in nature, clearer rules. Quicker processing of new arrivals that comes with having many more employees in place. Maybe we penalize employers who hire unauthorized immigrants knowingly, and generate some revenue that way. And also apply the stick in addition to the carrot. The carrot goes to the immigrants themselves. The stick goes to the corporations who are hiring illegal workers. But the border enforcement is the only piece that I sense we even potentially disagree about. We're in lockstep on the rest.
Yeah. I would prefer to see money for border control agents go to other things, but in a context where everything can be funded, I see no trouble with having a larger, more effective, more professional border control contingent.
Yeah, I told you privately not to politicize this, but I'm going to politicize it right now and answer my own rhetorical question of why haven't we gotten comprehensive immigration reform? And I think the problem, as I see it, is that the Republican Party in the 21st century doesn't want any immigrants coming in the country. You alluded to this at the top. Not just illegal immigration, they don't want legal immigration. And I think they don't want immigrants of any kind coming in because they fear the electoral ramifications for their minority coalition of white Christian conservatives. The people who come in the country are not white or Christian or conservative by and large. And this is simply selfish preservation of the political power of their minority coalition. That's my feeling.
I don't know that that's untrue. I would identify it as something else, a different party motivation, and I would connect it with all the anti-trans legislation we're seeing in this country, where they are giving their core voters something to hate. And
yeah,
it's not a big problem in North Carolina that trans women want to use a certain bathroom. That's not a significant issue in that state, but the GOP in that state has made it a primary issue because it gives their followers a target to hate and motivates a vote. And so I think, particularly with Trump's presidency, like his very first press release was about Mexican immigrants and how they're criminals. It's motivated by the same thing. If you give a certain type of voter something to hate, you can count on his or her vote. And so it's really driven by a very venal impulse just to get out a reliable vote. And I'm not sure how many of the people delivering these speeches really believe it. I think some of them might just see it as an expedient.
Yeah, good point. Hate really does sell when it comes to election issues. You know, I remember the 2004 election when John Kerry lost to George W. Bush largely because there were gay marriage initiatives put on so many state ballots. So people were voting against gay marriage at the time and also voting against Kerry.
Yeah.
And that might be the reason he lost that election. But anyhow, that's the example that comes to mind of how hate and fear motivates voters maybe more than positive emotions do.
Arguably, that's democracy's biggest flaw, is that hate and fear are more powerful motivators than love and fellowship.
Yeah. There's one other thing I want to say before we go, Mark, and again, to apply a little bit of his historical lens on this. You know, everyone acts like the current glut of immigration is unprecedented, and that's so not true. You know, there were at least 3 other periods in American history when immigration was going like gangbusters.
Sure.
And each time it was always contentious, bitterly opposed by the people who didn't want the immigrants to come in. And this leads me to a story I want to tell. I want the audience to hear this. So I'm half Sicilian. My grandfather came through Ellis Island in 1921, and my wife has done some really interesting genealogical research about my Sicilian ancestors. And I'm going to share with you one little piece of this, that when Sicilians came into the United States in the first couple decades of the 20th century, they seemed to go to 2 places, the Newark, New Jersey, New York City area, which is where my grandfather went, and New Orleans, Louisiana, of all places. A lot of Sicilians went to New Orleans.
Yeah.
And when they got to New Orleans, a lot of them were lynched.
Wow.
And I can't help thinking that the people who want to build a wall to keep out immigrants from the Americas today are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those white supremacists who lynched the Sicilian immigrants who ended up in Louisiana 100 years ago. I think there's a through line there, and we need to speak honestly about that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what triggered the anti-Irish sentiment was Irish immigration, many of them fleeing the potato famine. And I remember at one point growing up, I saw a picture in a history book of a sign that was hanging out a store that said, "No dogs are Irish," which I had trouble understanding how anyone could put up such a thing. But, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right. And the irony, of course, for me personally, is being half Irish and half Italian, I have Irish and Italian relatives who are vehement anti-immigration crusaders. And so they just seem to miss the whole point, as far as I'm concerned.
In the big picture of things, of course, unless you have Native American ancestry, every single one of us is descended from an immigrant.
Yes.
Every last one of us. So,
good point. I'm glad you put that on the record. Yes, yes. Well, thanks a lot. I thought your ideas were really great, and I'm looking forward to listening to this one again so I can even better understand where you're coming from there.
Oh, great. I'm glad it landed so well. So you ready for your question?
Yes.
Okay, so have you been following the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried?
A little bit. I read the New York Times daily bulletins. So, yeah, I know a little bit about that.
Okay, so for our listeners who have not been following the story, Sam Bankman-Fried was the CEO of FTX, which was a major cryptocurrency exchange and hedge fund. And he was recently convicted of fraud as a result of billions of dollars going missing under his watch. But my question isn't about FTX, and it's not about crypto. It's about the belief system that Bankman-Fried claims to have been his guiding principle in the business world. It's called effective altruism, which argues that to be truly altruistic, we should be analytical about cause and effect when considering our options, and then act in the way that brings about the greatest positive impact in the long run. Critics of effective altruism say that it provides moral cover for self-interested businessmen who can tell themselves that they're lying, cheating, and stealing today because they intend to become philanthropists tomorrow. Proponents of effective altruism say that it properly focuses the mind on the true outcomes of the decisions we make, rather than pretending that good intentions are all that matter. I feel like this is a topic on which intelligent people could disagree. So I'd like you, Joe, to read up on the topic, come back with an explanation of effective altruism for our listeners, and let us know what you think. Is it a valuable moral compass, or nothing more than a convenient smokescreen for morally bankrupt people like Sam Bankman-Fried?
Also known as Sam Bankrupt Fraud.
True.
At least I heard that joke making the rounds. Yeah, thanks. Good question. It occurred to me as you were outlining this question that it's possible the answer to be all of the above, right?
Sure.
Like maybe I might agree with both points of view, but we'll see where that takes me. Thank you. Okay, mansplaining listeners, really 3 things I want to leave you with at the end of this and every podcast, and that is ways to interact with Mark and me, ways to engage with what we're presenting here in these podcast episodes. There's really 3 ways to do it. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. You can check our sources there. We'd appreciate feedback. You can leave a comment on what you heard. You can ask questions. You can challenge some of the things we said. That's one important way to interact with us. The second way is to go to the platform where you get your podcasts, wherever that is. We're available on many different platforms, and give us a rating there. Of course, we'd love a 5-star rating, but any kind of feedback is helpful to us in a way to let us know whether we're doing right by you, the audience. And then the third thing I want to say is that we have a Google Voice number. The phone number is 206-486-4074. That's a place where you can leave a message, but also where you could pitch questions for Mark and me to answer in future episodes of this podcast. So any and all of those 3 ways are ways for you to interact with us, and we would very much appreciate to hear from you. But that's a wrap for this episode. That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.